The storm outside battered the windows of the small town, casting shadows on the dark streets. Inside a modest house, a woman named Clara found herself sitting in front of a single lamp, flipping through old police files. The room was littered with papers and photographs, each image more unsettling than the last. Clara had spent years trying to piece together the details of a murder that had haunted her town for decades. "This can't be it," she muttered, staring at the grainy photograph of a lifeless body. The case seemed to hold more questions than answers, and the only thing Clara was certain of was that the killer had never been caught. The police had given up long ago, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they missed, a clue buried beneath years of silence. She clenched her fists, determined to find the truth. The cold, calculated smile of the murderer loomed in her thoughts, taunting her from the shadows of the past. The next day, Clara sought out the only person who might still have answers, Detective Simmons. Once a young officer on the case, Simmons was now a tired man in his 50s, worn down by the weight of too many unsolved crimes. His office, small and dimly lit, smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. "You're still digging into this, huh?" Simmons asked, his voice a mix of resignation and bitterness. Clara nodded, determined to uncover the truth. "This town deserves closure," she said, her voice steady. The detective leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "I told them back then, Hayes is our guy, but we never found proof." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Hayes. That name had surfaced in her research. "Danny Hayes?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Simmons nodded grimly. "He was the prime suspect. But he disappeared right after the murder, and we lost him. Some say he's still out there hiding." Clara left the detective's office with a growing sense of unease. Danny Hayes, what had happened to him? Why had he disappeared so abruptly after the murder? Her mind raced as she drove through the quiet streets, her destination clear, the old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was the last known place Danny had been seen. She parked her car near the rusted gate and hesitated before stepping out. The house loomed before her, dark and desolate, its windows broken and doors hanging loosely from their hinges. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this place held the answers she was seeking, or maybe more questions. As she stepped inside, the musty air filled her lungs, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. She was not alone. Clara's heart raced as a faint noise echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. Was it just the wind, or was someone still living here? Clara crept through the house, the floorboards groaning under her weight as she moved cautiously through the dust-filled rooms. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional creak of the structure settling. She was drawn to the back room, a place that seemed to hold a deeper mystery. The walls were covered with old yellowed newspaper clippings, all related to Robert Greene's murder. The room was a shrine to obsession. In the corner, Clara noticed a box, its contents spilling out onto the floor. Old photographs of Danny Hayes, along with notes scribbled in a frantic, hasty hand. As she sifted through the papers, one name stood out: Robert Greene. Clara froze. Why was Danny so obsessed with the victim? The chilling realization hit her. This was no coincidence. The answer was closer than she thought. The photographs revealed more than Clara had bargained for. In one photo, Danny stood with Robert Greene at a charity event, their smiles fake, their eyes betraying an underlying tension. Clara flipped through the pages rapidly, each image more disturbing than the last. Danny had been close to Robert, much closer than she realized. But the most unsettling image was one of a letter written by Danny, describing in graphic detail the anger he felt toward Robert for ruining his life. Clara's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the past. Danny Hayes had a motive, a deep-seated hatred for Robert. But the question remained, if Danny was the killer, why hadn't the police ever found him? The answer, Clara feared, might be buried in the same shadows that had obscured the truth for so long. The next day, Clara visited the local police station to learn more about Danny Hayes and his disappearance. Detective Simmons had been her last hope, but he had given her little to work with. Still, She hoped to find something more in the old case files. As she entered the police station, the sterile smell of cleaning products filled the air. Officer Matthews, a young and eager rookie, greeted her at the front desk. "What can I help you with, Miss Clara?" he asked. Clara hesitated, unsure how to ask. "I'm looking for more information on Danny Hayes, the man who was suspected of killing Robert Greene. I think there's more to this case than they know." Matthews looked puzzled but led her to the back room where the cold case files were kept. As Clara sifted through the papers, one name kept appearing: Danny Hayes. He had been the prime suspect, but the investigation had failed to find any definitive proof. Clara could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her. Clara finally found what she was looking for, a folder marked Danny Hayes, missing person. She flipped it open to find a detailed report from the night of Robert Greene's murder. The report indicated that Danny had been seen arguing with Robert the night he died, but the witness accounts were contradictory. Some said they were close friends, while others claimed Danny had been furious with Robert. Clara knew she had to visit Danny's last known location, the old house he used to live in. It was now abandoned, decaying under the weight of years of neglect. She drove to the outskirts of town, her heart pounding in her chest. The house loomed before her like a forgotten relic, its windows shattered, its doors long since broken down. The air around the house was thick with the scent of decay. Clara stepped inside cautiously, the wooden floor creaking under her weight. Dust motes danced in the dim light, streaming through cracks in the walls. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, unsettling her more than she cared to admit. She was searching for something, anything that could tie Danny Hayes to Robert Greene's death. As she moved deeper into the house, she found an old room at the back, covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. They were all about Robert Greene and his murder. It was as if Danny had kept a shrine to the man he had once known. Clara's eyes narrowed as she studied the images. There were photos of Robert, sure, but also cryptic notes that didn't make sense. One of the notes read, "You owe me everything, Robert." Clara's pulse quickened. There it was again, Danny's motive. Clara's heart raced as she continued to search through Danny's personal effects. She had found enough evidence to confirm his obsession with Robert Greene. But there was more, a box hidden under the floorboards, filled with strange objects. Among them were old keys, maps of the town, and a small, dusty journal. The journal was crammed with details about Robert's daily life, as well as Danny's angry, disjointed thoughts. Clara flipped through the pages, reading one entry aloud to herself. "He thinks he can just throw me away like that. He has no idea what I'll do to him." It was clear that Danny had felt betrayed, but was that enough to push him to murder? Clara's thoughts raced. She needed to understand Danny's psychology. What had driven him to violence? Clara sat in her car, staring at the old house from the outside. The weight of the evidence she had uncovered was settling on her shoulders. She had to confront Detective Simmons again. Maybe he knew more about Danny's disappearance than he was letting on. She drove back to the police station, her mind racing with questions. What had happened to Danny Hayes? Why had he disappeared? When she arrived, she found Simmons sitting behind his desk, looking as if he hadn't moved in hours. "Detective," Clara said, her voice steady but urgent, "I need you to tell me everything you know about Danny Hayes." Simmons sighed deeply, his face weary from years of unresolved cases. "You're not going to like it, but there's something I didn't tell you before." He paused, looking her in the eye. "Danny Hayes isn't just missing. He's presumed dead, and I have a theory about what happened to him." Simmons leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the edge of the desk nervously. Clara waited, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean, presumed dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. The detective let out a long sigh. "We thought we'd found Danny's body years ago, buried out by the river," Simmons explained. "But when we dug it up, the body wasn't him. It was someone else." Clara's mind spun as she tried to make sense of this new revelation. A dead body, but not Danny's. If Danny had been alive all these years, where had he been? "We never found a trace of him after that," Simmons continued. "But I have a theory. I believe Danny might have faked his own death to escape the town, to disappear. But why would he do that after Robert died? Clara sat back, trying to process everything. If Danny had faked his death, it meant he was still out there hiding. And Clara was more determined than ever to find him. Clara left the police station with a renewed sense of urgency. Danny Hayes wasn't dead. He was alive, hiding somewhere in the shadows. She drove back to the river where the body had been found, hoping to uncover something new. The area was desolate, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. Clara walked carefully along the banks, her boots sinking into the soft mud. She remembered the report Simmons had shown her. The body found here hadn't matched Danny's DNA. But was there something about the body that had been overlooked? As she walked along the river's edge, her eyes caught something unusual, a small, crumpled piece of paper stuck between the rocks. She knelt down, carefully pulling it free. Paper was old, stained and folded several times. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a map, but not just any map. This one led to a location deep in the woods, a place Clara had never seen before. Clara followed the map, her steps quick and purposeful. The forest grew denser as she ventured deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around her. The map led her to a clearing, where the remains of an old cabin stood in the middle of the overgrown landscape. It was a place that time had forgotten. The roof had caved in, and the walls were covered with thick vines. Clara's pulse quickened as she approached the cabin, her hand gripping the map tightly. Was this where Danny had been hiding all these years? She stepped inside cautiously, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but there were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, a broken chair overturned in the corner. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't alone. Clara crept through the cabin, her every sense on high alert. The floorboards groaned under her feet as she moved cautiously through the wreckage. She knew she was getting closer to the answers, but something felt wrong. It was too quiet. As she moved deeper into the cabin, her eyes caught a glimpse of something. A small, old notebook sitting on a shelf, half hidden under a pile of broken furniture. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. The notebook was worn, its edges frayed from years of use. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages filled with handwritten notes. As she read, the reality of what she was uncovering hit her like a punch to the gut. Danny had been hiding here all along, but the notebook told a darker story. The entries detailed his growing paranoia, his belief that someone was watching him, hunting him. And one entry stood out, written in bold, frantic handwriting. "They know. They're coming for me." Clara sat down on the dusty floor, the notebook open in front of her. As she read the unsettling entries, her mind raced with questions. Who was Danny afraid of? And why had he been so paranoid? The last few entries were particularly disturbing, describing how Danny had started to receive strange visitors, men in suits whose faces he couldn't quite make out. "I don't know how long I can hide," one entry read. "The walls are closing in." Clara felt a deep pit form in her stomach. She wasn't sure what she had stumbled upon, but it was clear that Danny's fear had driven him to hide in this forsaken cabin. The question now was, what had happened to him? Clara had to find him before the people he feared found her first. She gathered her things and left the cabin, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery once and for all. Clara returned to the police station, her mind filled with the dark discoveries she had made in the cabin. The notebook had confirmed her fears. Danny Hayes had been hiding from someone, but who? And why had he been so terrified? She needed to speak to Simmons again. This time she felt like she was on the verge of breaking the case wide open. The detective was sitting at his desk when Clara walked into his office, her face grim. "You were right, Simmons," she said, her voice low and steady. "Danny's been hiding, and there's something much darker going on here." Simmons looked up at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Clara placed the notebook on his desk. "This is Danny's journal. He was scared of someone watching him, hunting him." Simmons read the journal with a furrowed brow, then placed it down carefully. "I've seen things like this before," he said, his voice quieter than usual. And I'm afraid it's going to get worse. Clara and Simmons drove to the edge of town, to a location that had become more familiar to Clara. The woods, where Danny had once hidden. The map she'd found earlier had led them here, but something told her that the answers they sought would not be easy to find. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, the wind howling through the branches, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. They arrived at an old, seemingly abandoned building, its walls covered with ivy, the windows shattered and dark. Clara's skin prickled as she stepped out of the car. This was it, the heart of Danny's paranoia. As she approached the door, she noticed something strange. The ground was littered with small objects, buttons, pieces of fabric, and blood. Her breath caught in her throat. Danny had left a trail, and someone else had been here too. Clara felt the weight of her discovery settle heavily in her chest. She wasn't just hunting Danny now. She was hunting someone else. Someone who might have been watching him all along. Clara and Simmons entered the building cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the rotting floorboards. The air inside was thick with dust, and the only sound was the distant creaking of wood. As they moved deeper into the building, Clara's heart raced. This place was far from abandoned. It was a hiding spot, a place for someone to disappear. She pushed open a door at the back of the building and gasped. Inside was a room filled with maps, photographs, and a wall covered in string. An intricate web connecting the dots of people, places, and events, all tied to Robert Greene's murder. It was clear now. Danny had been tracking Robert's life, trying to piece together a story of betrayal, and this was where he had been hiding from whoever had been after him. But who were they? And what had they done to him? Clara's mind raced as she studied the wall. There were names, dates, and locations that seemed to all connect back to the night of Robert Greene's murder. She noticed one name repeated more than others, Victor Hall. Clara had never heard of him before, but from the look of things, he was the key. Victor Hall was someone Danny had been obsessively tracking, and it seemed that Hall had been in town the night Robert died. Clara's stomach turned. Hall's involvement was no coincidence. He was connected to Robert in ways Clara hadn't yet understood. She turned to Simmons. "We need to find Victor Hall," she said, her voice urgent. "He's the last piece of the puzzle." Simmons nodded grimly, but before he could speak, Clara heard a sound, a loud crash from the other room. Someone else was in the building. Clara's heart pounded. They weren't alone. The crash echoed through the building, sending both Clara and Simmons into a state of alert. They rushed toward the noise, their weapons drawn, hearts racing. As they entered the next room, Clara's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a tall man, his features partially obscured by darkness. His cold, calculating gaze met Clara's, and in that instant she knew. This was Victor Hall. "You shouldn't have come here." Hall's voice was calm, almost disinterested, as if they were inconveniences more than threats. Simmons stepped forward, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Robert Greene." Hall smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of someone who knew how this would end. "It's too late for that," he said. And with that he lunged at them, disappearing into the darkness before Clara could react. The room plunged into darkness as Victor Hall vanished into the shadows. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest as she and Simmons scrambled to find their bearings. They were both trained to handle dangerous situations, but the eerie silence that followed Hall's disappearance was unlike anything they had ever experienced. "We need to find him," Clara whispered urgently, her breath shallow. Simmons nodded, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. They moved cautiously through the building, every creak of the floorboards sounding like an alarm. Clara could feel the weight of the past pressing in on her. They were so close now, and yet it felt as though the truth was slipping further away. The man they were after, the one who had been controlling everything from the shadows, was elusive, but Clara knew that he wouldn't be able to hide forever. Clara moved quietly, her instincts guiding her as they ventured deeper into the building. She could almost feel Victor Hall's presence in the air, like a specter watching their every move. Simmons remained close by, but even his steady presence couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. "There," Clara whispered, spotting a faint glow of light through a crack in a door. The two of them crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. As they pushed the door open, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room, filled with old documents, maps, and photographs. Everything pointed to one thing. Victor Hall had been orchestrating Robert Greene's death from the very beginning. There was a connection, a network of individuals whose names had been carefully erased from public record. Clara flipped through the documents, her hands trembling as she pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle. Clara's hands trembled as she found a photograph buried in a pile of old papers, a photograph of Victor Hall standing next to a man Clara had never seen before. The man's face was familiar, though, and as Clara stared at the image, a chilling realization hit her. The man in the photo was none other than Robert Greene's business partner, the one person who had never been mentioned in the investigation. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Victor Hall was never the mastermind, she said aloud. He was just the enforcer. The real mastermind was Robert's business partner. Simmons leaned over, looking at the photo. "That's impossible," he muttered. "No one ever mentioned him in the case." Clara shook her head. "Because they didn't want anyone to know the truth. This was all a setup, a calculated move to frame Danny Hayes." Clara knew she had to act fast. If Victor Hall was working for someone else, someone with power and influence, then the whole town could be in danger. She and Simmons couldn't afford to waste any more time. "We need to find Robert's partner," Clara said, her voice steady now with purpose. "He's the one who's been pulling the strings all along." Simmons nodded, his expression grim. "But where do we even begin? His name is nowhere to be found in any of the records." Clara stood up, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We find the man who tried to erase him. We start at the beginning." She turned, heading toward the door, but Simmons caught her arm. "Clara, wait. You're not going after this alone." Clara met his gaze and nodded. "We're in this together now. Let's finish it." Clara and Simmons tracked down the last known address of Robert Greene's business partner, a remote estate on the outskirts of town. The mansion stood tall, its stone walls covered in ivy, the windows dark and brooding. As they approached, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The estate seemed abandoned, but Clara knew better. This was where it would all end. She knocked on the door, and when no one answered, she forced her way inside. The house was eerily quiet. Clara moved through the grand hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Then, at the top of the stairs, she saw him. The man in the photograph. Robert's partner. His face was older now, more weathered, but the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and threatening. Clara didn't flinch. "It's over," she replied. "You're going to pay for what you did." Clara stepped into the darkened hallway of the mansion, her every instinct on high alert. The man, Robert Greene's business partner, stood at the top of the stairs, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Clara and Simmons. "I see you've come to finish what you started," he said, his voice cold. Clara didn't hesitate. "It's time to answer for everything," she replied, her voice steady. Simmons stood behind her, his posture tense but ready. The man smirked, a chilling laugh escaping his lips. "You really think you figured it all out? You're too late. The game's already over." Clara's blood ran cold. He was taunting them. He knew something they didn't. As he took a step forward, Clara instinctively reached for her gun, but before she could draw it, he vanished into the shadows of the mansion, leaving them with nothing but the echoes of his voice. Clara's heart raced as she moved further into the mansion, Simmons close behind. They passed through rooms that were eerily still, the air thick with dust and secrets. The place had once been grand, but now it felt like a haunted tomb. Clara's fingers tightened around her gun, every creak of the floorboards seeming to signal danger. "He's leading us into a trap," Simmons whispered, his voice filled with concern. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the mansion. "He's trying to buy time, but we won't let him get away." As they reached the back of the house, Clara's eyes caught sight of something strange, a flickering light coming from behind a door that had been carelessly left ajar. She motioned for Simmons to follow her. Together they pushed the door open. What they found inside would change everything. Inside the room, Clara and Simmons found a strange makeshift office. The walls were covered in maps and documents, many of them detailing the movements of both Robert Greene and Danny Hayes. It was clear now, Robert's business partner had been manipulating the entire situation from behind the scenes. Clara's eyes locked onto a large, detailed map of the town, with red pins marking key locations. Robert's office, the abandoned house, and several other places tied to Danny's life. One location stood out above the rest, an isolated cabin deep in the woods. Clara's stomach sank. This was where everything had begun. She turned to Simmons, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to get to that cabin now. He's going to try to finish this once and for all." Clara and Simmons made their way to the cabin deep in the woods. The air was thick with fog, and the path seemed to disappear into the dense trees. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was old and decrepit, barely standing under the weight of time. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the door, which was hanging off its hinges. This was the end of the line. "He's waiting for us," Simmons muttered under his breath. Clara didn't respond. She knew he was right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. As they stepped into the cabin, Clara was hit by the stench of decay. The place was empty, except for one thing. At the center of the room, a table was covered in documents, each one more incriminating than the last. The truth was right there, waiting to be uncovered. But Clara wasn't sure she was ready for what she was about to find. As Clara and Simmons moved deeper into the cabin, the truth finally began to piece itself together. Robert Greene's business partner had orchestrated everything. Not just Robert's murder, but the entire scheme to frame Danny Hayes. It was clear now, Danny had been a pawn in a much larger game. The partner's greed and ambition had driven him to eliminate Robert and take control of his empire. Clara felt sick to her stomach as she uncovered the final details in the documents. The last entry was a chilling one. If Danny survives, he must be eliminated. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Danny had been the last loose end, the one piece of evidence that could expose the truth. And now Victor Hall, his enforcer, was coming for them. "We need to leave. Now," Clara said, her voice trembling with urgency. Clara's heart raced as she and Simmons made their way back to the exit of the cabin. The air was thick with tension, the silence around them suffocating. She had barely moved a few steps when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves outside. Victor Hall was here. Clara turned to Simmons, her voice low but urgent. "Get ready. He's not going to let us leave without a fight." Simmons nodded, his hand tightening around his gun. They both knew this wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a final showdown. Clara could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything they had uncovered, all the lies and deception, had led them here, to this cabin in the woods. As she moved cautiously toward the door, the darkness outside seemed to come alive. Hall wasn't just a killer, he was the mastermind, and he was ready to end this once and for all. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Clara stepped out into the darkness, her eyes scanning the woods around her. The fog had thickened, and the trees loomed like silent watchers. There was no sign of Victor Hall, but Clara knew he was there, somewhere in the shadows. "He's waiting for us," Simmons whispered. Clara nodded, keeping her eyes focused on the path ahead. The woods were still too still, and the sense of being hunted was overwhelming. As they moved deeper into the forest, Clara heard a rustling from behind. She spun around, her gun drawn. But there was nothing there, just the cold night air and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the trees. "You think you've won, Clara? This is just the beginning." The voice came again, this time closer. "I never wanted to kill Robert," Victor Hall's voice echoed through the woods, full of cold malice. "But he was getting in my way. I had to make sure my plan worked. And Danny, he was the perfect scapegoat." Clara's blood ran cold. Everything Hall had said only confirmed what she'd suspected. The murder had been part of a much larger scheme, a power grab to seize Robert Greene's business empire. "And you, Clara," Hall continued, "you've been a thorn in my side from the moment you started digging. You should have stayed out of it. Now you'll pay the price." Clara turned to Simmons, her voice steady. "We end this now." Simmons nodded, and together they pressed forward into the darkness. The truth was finally within reach, and they wouldn't let Hall escape. Suddenly, Victor Hall stepped out from behind a tree, his figure illuminated by a brief flash of moonlight. "You're too late," he sneered, his face twisted with a dangerous smile. Clara's grip tightened on her gun as she took a step forward. "You're under arrest, Hall," she said, her voice sharp with authority. Hall raised his hands mockingly. "Arrest? I don't think so. You're the ones who are trapped." Before Clara could react, he moved with blinding speed, darting deeper into the trees. The chase was on. Clara and Simmons followed, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every step felt like it could be their last. Hall was desperate, but they couldn't let him escape. This time, the truth would come to light, no matter the cost. The chase led them to a clearing deep in the woods, where a single decrepit cabin stood. Hall was backed into a corner now. The light from their flashlights danced across the old weathered walls. "This is it, Hall," Clara called out, her voice filled with resolve. "There's nowhere left to run." Hall's face twisted in anger. "You think you've won? You have no idea what's at stake," he spat. But there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. Clara took a step forward. "You're done. We know everything." With that, she and Simmons closed in. Hall lunged toward them, but in the final moment, Clara fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the stillness of the night. Hall crumpled to the ground, his last breath rattling out of him. The nightmare was over.